Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and for all the ways the previous era of Rangers was divisive, to say the least, there is one proclamation that seems to remain fairly consistent throughout, that, if nothing else, it gave us Dino Charge. It's a season that stands for many as the greatest example of what Neo Saban could have been the whole time, but it does make sense that this ended up being the case even before they started filming for several important reasons. As many of us know, the rushed production schedule and copy-paste mandates of Samurai held back a lot of what that season could do. And of course, with Megaforce, the need to cram 2 Sentai into an anniversary season was always going to be hit or miss. Conversely, Dino Charge and Dino Supercharge a year later were both ideally positioned to be something more coherent at worst, or something special at best, because none of those aforementioned limitations applied to their production cycle. Adding to that, PR veteran Chip Lin was called in to be an executive producer, and with the way the Neo Saban era wanted to embrace the foundational elements of the previous Saban stint, albeit haphazardly at times, this was optimal timing, since Lin has always been more of a breezy, lighthearted showrunner who isn't as big a fan of larger scale seasons. As such, adapting Kyoryuger was a perfect fit, because the Sentai in question has a lot in common with MMPR, even beyond the motif. And as far as wanting to be the next MMPR goes, adapting that specific Sentai, embracing ancient powers while at the same time operating largely by way of modern technology, and doing so with a unique charm and energy all their own, is as good a setup as they were ever gonna get. And those toys flew off Japanese shelves, so from a business perspective, they were certainly hoping for a comparable trend in the States and beyond. All this to say that the stars were kind of aligning here, which naturally begs the question of how it all came together as a viewing experience. So let's dig a little deeper into that. Structurally, this essay might feel a bit different because the idea is to talk about Dino Supercharge in a separate video, but even still, Dino Charge as its own 22 episode season provides some interesting points of conversation on several fronts, all of which really come back to the team itself. So in as far as I can talk about the characters, I thought it would work best to weave that discussion through a closer look at how the Energems work, not just as a battery recharger, but as a character catalyst. I think the power source of this season is one of the better concepts that PR has ever developed. Firstly, their status as impossibly old sources of dino energy that have scattered throughout history allowed Chip Lin and his team to introduce Koda and Ivan as men out of time, to say nothing of how the de-aging mechanic speaks to James Navarro, but he's a next time topic. The interesting thing here is that for as gimmicky as that whole idea could have easily come off as, this show sticks with it with surprising effectiveness and created 2 charming characters as a result. For Koda specifically, his background was a really smart way for the writers to reinterpret No-san's brute strength fighting style. Yoshi Sudarso being a Sentai fan on top of that was just an added bonus, and it gave him all the motivation he needed to put everything into the part and do right by his equally lovable Stego counterpart. But it's never just the fact that Koda is a caveman incapable of fully grasping modern civilization. He is given his fair share of jokes leading into that, but early on, we're treated to a season highlight in Return of the Caveman. Being an older brother in real life, it's an episode that I imagine was harder on Yoshi to film, since the emotional weight of being trapped inside a time not your own is funneled through Koda's younger brother, a younger brother that he thinks he'll never see again, and who needed to live the rest of his young life without Koda. But what the episode seeks to tell us in its own somewhat clunky way is that for all the harrowing thoughts and memories of yesteryear, there is still a lot of good that can be done today. There's still a place for this caveman as a true hero in a modern day society that, for example, is largely incapable of building a fire. Through Koda, much more so than Ivan, they thought about the weight he'd carry leaving his old world behind and how genuinely terrifying that could be. And we can only infer all the hard work Kendall did in the backdrop just to help him get to this point. Now, Ivan is naturally structured a lot differently because his relative proximity to the modern day would present different, but far more manageable, concerns about fitting in. So they accomplished that by essentially squeezing his gold counterpart's hilariously all over the place path to acceptance into a pair of episodes. And this is really where the writers went all out with what Ivan's unique characteristics could be used to convey, and in doing so, conceived perhaps the greatest scene in the era's history, made all the funnier by the idea that these randos all happily agreed to the very vague quest Ivan proposed. only to not want to fight evil monsters for some reason. Which is a shame, because I could see that stop sign being used to confuse the Viveks into actually stopping, because traffic safety matters, of course. This would have accomplished the goal of putting a smile on Red Racer's face from half a world away, while Granny runs over their toes on her scooter. But the fun doesn't end there, because shortly after, the writers lean into his motif as a means of turning Tyler into an aggressively petty and jealous version of himself. The fact that Tyler feels like his chances with Shelby are being threatened by a literal knight in shining armor, one who agrees with the notion that he is, and I quote, the whole package, is a better 22-minute joke than we deserve. It's neat how these men, living centuries, entire millenniums beyond the scope of what they once called home, sort of balance each other out. With Kota, he's always operating in this impossibly genuine, adorable manner that does well to emphasize his big heart and his willingness to learn and adjust, so Return of the Caveman plays into all of that. But with Ivan, his character backdrop is used almost exclusively to do things you otherwise couldn't do with anyone else on the team. And initially, he seeks to approach this world in the way he's always known, as directly opposed to trying to adapt to it, which in turn gives us the most heartfelt episode on Kota's end, and two of the most laugh-out-loud funny episodes when Ivan's the focal point. And at one point they share a joke about how both of them used to think the Earth was flat, so, like, how can you not love them? There's not as much to say about Riley, outside of how loud and proud the season seemed to be about presenting the dumbest possible smart guy episode. And it really only serves the one overarching plotline in Season 1 concerning locating Tyler's lost father, only to realize that it was Ivan inside Fury the whole time. So I'd argue they don't quite use his unique farm boy upbringing to great effect here, or really most of his characteristics. But he does make for a neat counterpoint to Chase, even if bluntly so. But there's a bit of nuance tucked away in there too, when we think about how they resolve their surface level differences and learn to coexist. In the context of their shared focus episode, we're meant to see them as on opposing ends of the responsibility spectrum. Keeper is also there. But thinking more about it, they seem destined to reconcile not necessarily because Riley sees a new side to Chase, but because they're a lot alike in important ways. They're both caring brothers who go out of their way for their equally supportive siblings. Neither one is overly willing to admit fault at first, but will always seek to make things right if they can. And in embodying these traits, both of them prove to be so much more than what the two first provides us as a clash of perspectives. If anything, I think the show sells this pair short. And you can easily see how sharing cute little anecdotes about brotherhood and the highs and lows thereof would have made more sense as a point of connection and conflict resolution. Especially considering that over the course of both seasons, we can see how both engage strongly with the familial aspects of their characters, a family they can't see as often, which means they need to be their own brothers, just like the last Green and Black pair. And in some ways, they still sort of accomplish that, in spite of Riley being a touch underwhelming. But I do think, on the other hand, that Chase ends up being one of the more well-realized characters when it's all said and done. A lot of the Tyler discussion is going to be housed in the Dino Supercharge video, since you can't really talk about him in full without also discussing how his defining motivation to find James Navarro plays out. But I do think most of what you need to know about him is very apparent already. Brennan Mejia might just be one of the most charismatic Reds we've ever seen, a trait further emphasized coming off the heels of 4 years of not that. And all it takes is one episode to know exactly what you're getting with him. A narratively dialed back take on Wes, basically, complete with the need to reconnect to a father alongside being the source of affection for, and often taking a backseat to, a self-empowered headstrong Pink Ranger. And given how Time Force doesn't sit well with Chip Lim due to his aforementioned affinity for the fluffier Ranger storylines, you wonder if this was the version of those characters he would have penned back then, had all those writers' room wars never happened. Despite all of that though, I do think that Shelby Watkins is at the very least in the ballpark of a Jen Scotts as a character, even just in the context of this season. The stakes are a lot lower of course, but the way she progresses over time perfectly fits the story she finds herself in. A progression that speaks to the second reason that I love the Energems as character catalysts. They serve the function of granting us two wonderful characters by way of the show's internal logic. But they're also used to carry and highlight a lot of the characterization we get in a show that lives and breathes off its characters considerably more than a lot of seasons prior to and since. We see the Energems bond off the Rangers due to true acts of heroism, but we also see how that heroism was not an accident. Return of the Caveman and Breaking Black are both positioned as sort of confirmation tests on that front, both meant to echo how Coda and Chase respectively came by their powers. Tyler plays Hero Ball every other episode, so he never needed any one episode dedicated to that. But all of that pales in comparison to how the Energems are used to push Shelby's individual story forward, and Kendall makes that point all too clear when she directly questions why the pink Energem chose her at all. And in response, Shelby does nothing but prove why she was always so much more than Kendall gave her credit for. It starts by risking herself to save the pink Energem when nobody else could at the time, and then it builds further into her revolutionizing Energem tracking with her dinosaur knowledge, and then she ends up as the de facto most valuable ranger anytime the team needs to do fieldwork that isn't strictly fighting. It's not as comprehensive a prove-yourself story as that of Casey's, for example, but it's still handled pretty excellently here, while not overshadowing the other characters too much. And not only does she earn Kendall's respect, but she also takes it one step further by meeting her hero, realizing he kind of sucks, and becoming the driving force that turns him back into the man she thought he was. Dino Charge went all in on Shelby, and every step of it just worked for me. Even without being the official leader here, she really was the team's determined and motivated focal point. And unlike when they really tried but hilariously failed to make Riley seem like the big brain of the bunch, Shelby's expertise in the exact areas that matter most to the mission makes her come out considerably more believable in that regard. You just kind of wish there was nearly as much to say about Prince Philip. But in all fairness, it was never going to be easy balancing 6 other Rangers alongside Kendall running things and Keeper pretending to be useful, and the production team knew it would be a trying task, so they kept things simple while doing as best they could with how the Graphite Ranger was presented. He's a rich prince who doesn't understand how genuine heroism works, so he tries to fix that in the only way he knows how before actually fixing that. Although I do think it would have been amazing if he was able to stick around for a couple more jokes about how painfully out of touch he is. Now before we get to my favorite museum director, let's talk about how the villains work this go round. Dino Charge would be the first time since RPM where the other side of the conflict went through a true-to-form conceptual overhaul, as opposed to just a few adjustments like with the very similar, but also remarkably better utilized Western Juzo and Dayu. But there is very clear inspiration drawn from Zed and Rita, right down to Sledge and Poisandra's premarital problems being just as emotionally draining for them as anything the Rangers are doing. Adding to that, both Sledge and the very not Kyoryuger aesthetic that comes with him were all built from the ground up, as was Keeper as a means of further adding to the dinosaur motif, but with an added extraterrestrial edge. And like much of early Rangers, there's a weird bit of dark humor to the way that Sledge's asteroid collection, which is treated like any other odd collecting hobby, fundamentally rocks the Earth to its core when lost. I'm not huge on what this shift meant for the Kyoryuger carryover villains, but I also think that Sledge himself works better specifically as a PR lead villain than the High Priest of Chaos who still shows up in Super. I did like Heckle more, all things considered, but we'll talk plenty about him next time. So without any further ado, let's finally discuss the wonderful Kendall Morgan. There is really not much I don't love about her as a character. I adore her over-insistence on being professional, a quirk that fits seamlessly with the fact that she's extremely young for her position, so it stands to reason that course-correcting any casual uses of her first name, except with Coda, would be a good enough way to stave off imposter syndrome. I like that she has this softer side about her, even as it pertains to children, that she's realistically unsure about leaning on too much. And most of all, I love how underneath all of that, she's a giant nerd who takes unadulterated pride in recognizing Shelby's accomplishments with Dino Dome, because it's unironically an invaluable reward to her. But looking beyond my obvious and far too well documented affinity for Kendall, what I really wanted to talk about is her journey towards becoming the Purple Ranger. Upon rewatching the series for this video, and paying extra attention to that facet of her character, her build-up to Plesio power intrigued me. And that's because it both works and doesn't work depending on how you view her arc of sorts. Allow me to explain. On the one hand, she's never outright conveyed as someone who believes she needs to be more to be of service. If anything, her current slew of responsibilities keeps her plenty occupied already. And even when she's barely fending off Vivix with a shovel, it wasn't positioned as a wake-up call, so her inability to defend herself as formidably as the Rangers is less a hurdle to be cleared and more the status quo. So given all of that, we can see how it's kind of odd that she still got to do the whole Ranger thing anyway. But on the other hand, her journey towards this point is fascinating, specifically because it was built off a spur-of-the-moment decision. A decision that forced her to rely on quicker thinking in order to be the saver and not the saved, when her original plan ends up compromised. And that quickness matters, because for her, being a technical advisor / working professional means being able to prepare and plan things out over time, even with a few eureka moments every now and then. Sledge's ship presents the perfect challenge to the mindset she's accustomed to. It doesn't quite fall in line with how, for example, a more consistently handled arc for Sky Tate would work, in where becoming SBD's leader is a natural extension of realizing his shortcomings and acting accordingly, but, as we touched on, it does fit with how the Energems tend to choose their hosts, Rangers who invoke spur-of-the-moment heroism based on whatever responsibility or ability they happen to most embody. Tyler gets his, and bonds to it because he's an explorer by nature and seeks to save Shelby. Shelby gets hers because she is literally and figuratively fighting tooth and nail to be recognized for her abilities. And our original Purple in Albert, great a man as he is, got it by helping some girl before realizing the task was much bigger than he bargained for. So, in that sense, her journey is perfect, because with a moment's notice, she has to act, but still manages to use her smarts to make it through Sledge's ship for Keeper's sake. And as a direct result, the better than it gets credit for narrative device that is the Energem recognizes that. And that's really how the story, insofar as there is one, works in Dino Charge, because the thing about either season is that it never really builds up to anything in a Jungle Fury kind of way. Most character moments come by way of understanding and not so much developing, and it's not looking to comment on the grayness of the conflict like either space-themed season. Sledge & Company's Moon Palace inspirations make the evil side of this conflict very clear, although Keeper seems adamant about challenging that notion in Super. Rather, Dino Charge speaks through its large cast, since almost half the season, including both the premiere and the finale, is dedicated to, in some way, bringing this Ranger team together. To say nothing of the plot points in Let Sleeping Zords Lie, and episodes like it, dedicated to bringing specific characters together. The production team knew that this many mouths to feed would weigh down any attempt at a higher-reaching story. So, they decided to make the team itself the story, and supporting that goal is an MMPR aesthetic and tone, but guided through the lens of a more focused season, like an In Space, where there's a definitive mission, a definitive endpoint, and even their own boss dungeon raid. And it all just works. Not always, and not completely, but in my mind, Dino Charge has it where it counts, and it has it in spades. And next time we talk Rangers, we'll discuss what the deal with Dino Supercharge is, and figure out if it's really as much of a downgrade as many claim. But until then, thanks for watching.